Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Horizonte speaker series. I'm John Price, Managing Director of AMI, the market intelligence firm focused on Latin America that launched this speaker series. Today, we have the pleasure of inviting a true gentleman and a real veteran of the region, Ambassador Guillermo Rishchynski, formerly Canada's ambassador to Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, as well as executive director of the Inter-American Development Bank, among other postings of interest. And I've had the pleasure of knowing the ambassador for several years now, and just a wonderful guy who has a real breadth of knowledge. And in this particularly troubling period of time in Latin America politically, I think it's useful to hear from someone who brings an arc of experience, over 30 years of experience in the region, just to put everything in context, because we rarely have such a perspective to lean upon when we're trying to manage our businesses in Latin America. We so often look through a very short-term window, and I think that brings upon levels of sort of anxiety that are not necessarily helpful. And so I'm very, very pleased, and I think it's very timely that we have the ambassador with us. Before I bring the ambassador onto the program, I just want to walk you through on the next slide again, what is Horizontes and why are we here? So AMI, the company that is sponsoring this, we are a Latin American focused market intelligence firm, and we, for the last 31 years, have been helping companies to navigate Latin American markets, gather intelligence for them, provide them with strategy and advisory. We work a number of sectors, and that work has enabled us to, get very close with leaders, business leaders in particular, but also political leaders in the region. And what became clear to us was that although there's plenty of sources of inspiration and leadership and guidance found for business people in the United States, in Europe, other parts of the world, as well as individual countries, particularly large countries like Brazil and Mexico and Chile, there's very few people out there, or we're exposed to very few people, and the lessons and wisdom of people who share the common challenge that we all have of managing Latin American businesses. In other words, businesses that may have as few as 3 jurisdictions, as many as 30 jurisdictions in our region. And that's a unique challenge, and we are a unique universe of people facing that challenge. And so we started this series in the hopes of interviewing key leaders and learning from them. And in recent months, we've spoken with Maran Lau of Meta, i.e. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. We've spoken with Mauricio Ortiz, Regional President of Latin America at Boston Scientific. We've talked with Dominique Verchot, who runs South America for Korn Ferry. And most recently, we spoke with Kelvin Dushnisky, former CEO of Barrick Gold, and former president of Barrick Gold and CEO of Anglo Gold Ashanti. And those were all successful conversations, and we're hoping to replicate that. And I know we'll have a great conversation because the ambassador is if nothing else, a wonderful conversationalist. So, Ambassador, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera and joining the conversation, and I think Abel, we can move to full screen. Ambassador, welcome. Nice to see you again.
Thanks so much, John. Good to join all of you today.
Great to have you. I've really enjoyed our conversations over recent years, our collaboration on the board of the Canadian Council of the Americas, seeing you in action with your former colleagues at DFATE. And I think, before we delve into the meatier subjects that we've put in place to talk about today, I thought it would be great to get a little bit more of your personal background. I know you studied at McGill, which people outside, particularly in Latin America, recognize as one of the best known and best run universities in Canada. But tell us a little bit about where you grew up and
Sure.
also your early career,
Mhm.
I guess, started in the private sector,
Indeed. Yeah.
and finally, how it is that you came to focus on Latin America.
Well, thanks, John, and delighted to be able to join you today. I'm Canadian born. I was born in Toronto. My dad is a good Ukrainian from Saskatchewan, and my mother is a Panameña. She came from Panama to go to school after the war here, and they met in Toronto and married. And then about 6 weeks after I was born, my parents moved back to Panama. So I began life in Spanish, living in Panama till about the age of 9, almost 10. And my dad was working in those days for Gibson, the appliance company, and then subsequently for Westinghouse. And we migrated north, as people say, and lived for a while in Michigan and Ohio. And then during my high school years, my dad was at Westinghouse World Headquarters in New York City. And I finished high school out on Long Island in probably the most quintessential of names of high schools in the United States, John H. Glenn High School, named after the astronaut. Right. And I always intended to come back to Canada at some point. We visited, obviously, for family reasons. And McGill was the place that chose me. And I spent 4 wonderful years there, stayed for 2 years working in Montreal in the transportation sector. My first job out of university was working for a shipping agency that handled ships into the St. Lawrence. So international trade was never far from my mind. And then after 6 years in Montreal, I moved down to Ottawa to work for an international trading company that had been set up in the mid-70s called Interimco. Jean-Luc Pepin, who had been the Minister of Industry and Trade, had set this up after he had finished in political life. And I always say that was my MBA in international trade, being a marketing representative and a project manager in Africa and in Latin America. And it was a good life, but I was on the road 180 to 200 days a year, and it started to grind pretty hard on the body. And then I met my wife, who's from Honduras, and we needed to be together. So she came after our marriage to live in Canada, and I was still traveling 180 plus days a year. And a friend of mine who had grown up in the Foreign Service told me that they were sitting the Foreign Service exam in October. This was in the summer of 1981. And he said, you should sign up for that exam. That might be good for you, the Foreign Service. So that was the extent of my diplomatic commitment initially, if you will, to write the exam and see what happened. And I joined the Trade Commissioner Service in 1982, took a pretty hefty cut in salary from the private sector to government, which my father thought was insane with a child on the way, but never looked back, and had a wonderful career of 38 years with the government of Canada, and most of it in Latin America. But initially, I tried my hand at different things at the Middle East, at Southeast Asia. We lived for a while in Jordan and Indonesia and Australia. But I guess it was only natural that I would gravitate back to the part of the world that I know best. And so the last almost half of my career was spent almost exclusively in the Western Hemisphere. And now I enjoy blissful retirement, and look back on those years and ask myself, how did I ever move around so much? My wife reminds me that when I joined the Foreign Service, I told her that it would bring stability into our lives. And she has counted that she has moved house 23 times during the course of our career. And so much for the stability argument. That's one that I lose on a regular basis. But it's very rewarding, and lived through a lot of change in Latin America and in the world, for that matter. When I started, telex was the foremost means of communication, and now it's email and the internet. And the region itself, when I first was posted there in Brazil in the 1980s, was a very different cat than what it is today. Most of the countries were governed by military dictatorships, closed economies, capital controls, import licensing requirements, tough places to do business. But if there's one thing that I take away from from all of the years spent in this part of the world is that the resilience of Latin America is singular. Even in the darkest of economic circumstances, I saw people who knew how to make money in those circumstances. The level of entrepreneurial skill in Latin America is not something that I think is emphasized sufficiently. People in this region, restructure, recommit, come back from the dead and move on, and don't dwell on failure, because failure is something that is endemic, and it's going to happen. It has happened. It's part of the history of the region. But the forward push, if you will, in the region to always look towards the future in terms of possibility, I think is constrained by the chains of historical experience in a region whose history has been pretty rough. I mean, from the point of view of what individual societies have gone through. So I think that the resilience and entrepreneurship, I think, are things that work to Latin America's favor, but its history and the drag of history, on its ability to forge consensus for the future is something that is still very much a work in progress.
Yeah, no, that's a great perspective. I mean, your personal story really resonates with me. My father joined the same trade commissioner service, went through the exam period, et cetera, and I moved 11 times before I went to university, through the later stages of his diplomatic career, and then the private sector. He did not slow his gypsy lifestyle in the private sector any more than he enjoyed it in the diplomatic circle. And what you're saying about Latin America is, if necessity is the mother of invention, Latin Americans and frankly anybody in the developing world, the challenges they face just getting to work, just navigating the most mundane tasks requires a level of creativity because of some of the obstacles in their way. And I think for many of us who've worked in the region, say only in the last 15 years, we've been somewhat spoiled by a pretty steady stream of improvements around the policy frameworks, around the ability to conduct business in a more transparent way than was the case, say, years ago. But there is definitely concern today about the proliferation of populism in Latin America, which some believe, and I think there's a fair argument to be made in certain jurisdictions, that it has eroded some of this institutional framework that's been built over the last 20 years. So, given your experience and looking back on 4 decades of knowing this region, how do you see today's political climate compared with the best and worst of what you saw during your career? And why do you think populism is making a comeback, if it is in fact doing so?
Well, I think populism in the region is not new. I mean, populism has been around almost since the post-independence period in the early 19th century. The rule of a strong person, a strong man, it was something that was endemic to the region. Virtually every country's history has periods of dictatorship, where one person and or their family basically ran the show and ran it reasonably until such time as they didn't, and then they were swept away and usually replaced by somebody else. Populism knows no ideological color in Latin America. We have populism of both the left and the right. And what populism is in Latin America, I think, is solutions that are preferred by individuals or groups of individuals, that they can solve the endemic problems of the society if people leave them alone to govern. And that's the bargain. We govern, and you do well, and life goes on until it doesn't, and then things begin to fall apart. I mean, I find it a fascinating phenomenon that a country as advanced as Argentina still lives in the shadow of a populist who died, 50 years ago. And there are other examples of this in the region as well. The shadow of history and the populist solutions of the past is something that's never far from the surface. And now, as things become more complicated, as the world works through crises that are that are existential in nature, things like the pandemic, things like the financial crisis in the earlier part of this century. People are looking again for solutions and those who can implement solutions to bring improvement to their lives. And there has always been a tendency politically in the region, for good or bad, to look at saviors, people who emerge on the scene with a message, that says, "Put your faith in me, and all will be well." And maybe it has something to do with the religious, mystical traditions of the region, but that is very much back in the fore. And we see a number of leaders in the region who basically have taken those populist characteristics, if you will, and forged them into political movements, which I think also speaks to the very decaying nature of political parties. From the 90s onward, we had a situation where party establishments, institutions, the institutions of democracy, and the regulatory frameworks that were set up in the region came to the fore, if you will, as the way to organize societal behavior and societal interaction. As the problems become more complex, people inevitably seem to default to more simplistic solutions. And there are those in the political arena, whether it's a Bolsonaro, whether it's a Bukele, who can look at that situation and harness it to their political benefit and then rule accordingly. And it is a tendency that is disconcerting, because it would be, I think, much better in the long haul if people's faith in institutions remained paramount as opposed to faith in individuals. But that is the nature of the beast, and the region will work its way through this. And we shouldn't resign ourselves to be despondent about it. It's part of the arc of history, and something that Latin America will emerge from in the next iteration.
Yeah, that's a great point about the fragmentation of the political system. I think that a lot of it has to do with the similar fragmentation of communication channels, where we used to live in a world of very consolidated communication channels. So it made sense that we had a consolidated political system that communicated through that. But as these tools emerge through the internet that allow, and social media that allow for individuals to brand themselves and gain huge audiences as individuals, that has allowed sort of celebrity personality politicians to emerge and supplant this well-developed party structure. Some countries have resisted that, but you're absolutely right. Look at Peru. I mean, every time there's an election in Peru, there's 15 candidates going for the presidency. So I think as you say, it's not about fighting that. We've made that technological transition. The question is, how do you transition politically while still maintaining institutional integrity and the necessary building blocks of democracy? I want to just remind everyone on the call, and a couple of people have already responded with questions. We do have a Q&A button. This is a Zoom call, so please type in your questions there, and I'm going to do my best to weave them into the conversation with the ambassador. Ambassador, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but it seems that Washington no longer enjoys the level of hegemony in Latin America it once did. China today is the largest export customer for several countries in the region, the largest creditor to an equal number of these countries, as well as a leading foreign investor. You've got Europe, who still is European companies are still important sources of direct investment, technical assistance, and certainly political allies on international forums. You've got India is now a growing customer of particular Latin American natural resources. For some, Russia's important. Canada's no slouch when it comes to foreign direct investment in things like infrastructure, energy, and mining. Can we say that Latin America, the new reality is a multipolar world? And if you agree, have Latin American countries sufficiently adapted their foreign relations policies and positions to this new world, and which countries are doing the best job at managing these, serving all of these different allies and commercial interests today versus those who maybe haven't made the shift?
Yeah, I think, John, we have to distinguish between the economic and the political realm at the outset in a discussion of where the region is in the global order. I think the globalization phenomenon that took root in the 1990s expanded the horizon, if you will, for Latin America to look beyond the United States primarily, and Europe to a secondary degree, in terms of both customers for the things that they produce and sources of potential foreign investment coming into the region. So I think Latin Americans became important elements of the global supply chain, primarily from a raw materials perspective, regrettably, but they were important suppliers of commodities, if you will, to the growing economies of Asia and to China specifically. Politically, I think Latin America has lagged in terms of taking advantage of that position as a major economic player in the global economy into taking positions in terms of the global geopolitical debates that would put it in a position not necessarily of leadership, but one of being an active stakeholder. And I think some of that is that there's enough on their plate at home, to be honest, and the challenges of regional integration are still ongoing. I mean, Latin America has a long way to go in terms of getting its own internal house in order and the breakdown of barriers so that they can trade more effectively with each other. And secondly, those larger global geopolitical questions are one where I think Latin Americans recognize that their relative influence is not going to be that large. And that's a double-edged sword, because when you read futurists who write about the world of 2050 and beyond, Latin America figures very little in it. And the fact that the education system in Latin America lagged in terms of full embrace of the knowledge economy of the 21st century is something that's also, I think, keeping Latin America from perhaps playing a much more concerted global role as a region. Certainly, there are individuals from Latin America who have enormous global standing and following, but the countries of the region themselves, because they don't act as a bloc necessarily, they act as individual entities in the way they position themselves politically in the world. I think it's a missed opportunity up until now, but that could change in the future. And I'm optimistic that there will be a much larger and fulsome role for the Latin American countries to play in the world order as we go forward, because Latin America has so much of what that new world order is going to require, whether it's lithium, whether it's food, whether it's water, and certainly better manufacturing capability than they had previously. I think this will serve Latin America in enormously good stead going forward.
Now, what about individual countries? The Ukrainian war has put a bit of more than a bit of a divide between not only the U.S. and Russia, but potentially the U.S. and China. And there's been several issues, whether it's the rollout of 5G technology, whether it's the shipment of arms, where countries increasingly are asked to choose one master or the other, i.e. China versus the United States in particular. Which countries in Latin America you think are doing the best job at keeping good relations open with both of those countries, if not additional countries?
Yeah, I think actually most have recoiled from the either or kind of menu, if you will, that is being positioned out there by many pundits, and in fact, many in the United States. I think that bodes well for the region, because taking sides is not something that doesn't come with cost. And the Venezuelas, Cubas, Nicaraguas of the world, well, they've made their choices and they're stuck with those choices for the foreseeable future. And you don't see much dynamism in those societies and economies in terms of where the future might take them. But I think Brazil has been very prudent. When Lula was asked just recently about the Ukraine war, he made a very telling comment. He said, we don't really understand the causes of all that. It's pretty far away. It's not something that has impacted on us from a political perspective. And so I think they're going to keep their options open and see where things go in the relative future, and be in a position to perhaps, as the world comes together to try to address that situation, play the kind of constructive role that Latin American countries played, in the interwar years in the early 20th century, the creation of the United Nations, the role of the Latin participants in those global conferences is not something that is much written about, but they were key players in terms of forging the consensus necessary to move the world forward. And I think Latin America has the ability to position itself again in that type of role as we work our way through not only the problems of the Ukraine, but of climate change and all of the questions that are on the order paper right now in terms of how the world is going to look over the course of the next 50 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think there was almost a bigger voice for them on the global stage in the sort of development of the South-South, these blocks of alliances with Africa and Asia in the sort of more weighty days of the United Nations, and lobbying for budgets and for development budgets and things like that. Just switching gears more to the private sector for a second here. Canadian ambassadors in Latin America, they spend a lot of time and energy on commercial issues, which I guess is a testament to the relative peace of the region. But what do you think are the challenges facing foreign investors in Latin America today, and how those changed over time, and which are the concerns that still remain today? Yeah. So if you go back in your career, what were some of the issues that they dealt with back then, and how did those change
I think
over time?
Volatility, first and foremost, John, it's part of the landscape in the region. I mean, something very small can escalate very quickly into a national crisis in many countries of the region. I mean, even a country as advanced as Chile, a rise in bus fare for students, set off weeks of disorder and strikes and demonstrations. And there are a lot of pent-up passions beneath the surface as a function of history, as a function of inequality. And I think with people now seeing the gains that they've made over the last 20 years at potential risk in environments that are quite shaky, it's going to be something that is going to be cause for concern for foreign investors. And I think at first level, the role of an ambassador or a senior trade commissioner working in Latin America is to provide the level of reassurance necessary to the investors that, if there is an incident, that this can be managed. And secondly, I think if there are problems of a regulatory nature because the rules of the game have changed, this government's change, then the diplomatic representatives become the chief lobbyists for the investors from their country to ensure that the not only spirit but letter of agreements previously entered into with the country are met to the letter of the law. I always used to joke with my colleagues at embassies that what we were really were firefighters. Right. When there was a problem, you strap on your tank and you go and try to put that fire out until there's a bigger one somewhere else, and then you continue to work on both, but you focus on the one that is the most impactful at the moment. And that's just the nature of the region, that you're going to have ups and downs at a level of speed and regularity that is much greater than what you see in fully developed economies in Europe and in North America. And that's just part of the landscape. You need to go in with your eyes wide open. I think most foreign investors do, but a lot, at the first sign of trouble, begin to waffle. And if there's a lesson I learned from the 1980s and 90s is that if things get tough and you jump and walk away, the cost of coming back in at some point in the future will escalate to the point of not being tenable. And, the best example I can give you of that is during the height of the debt crises of the 1980s. I mean, when Canadian banks had retail licenses in countries like Brazil, they sold those licenses off, they left, and now the cost of entering Brazil and purchasing a piece of a retail banking license is probably beyond the scope of most banking institutions other than the very largest. So you have to be in for the long haul. You have to hunker down. You always have to have an emergency scenario to fall back on, and using the diplomatic representation in the country to basically underscore the points that you're trying to make with local authority is something that every investor should be thinking about. That if they go into, to make a representation to a particular ministry, that they do so in the company of their diplomatic representative, because that allows them to underscore the point that this is bigger than just a corporate issue. This is an issue of how a country like Canada expects their foreign investors to be treated. And in an era of free trade agreements where all countries have agreed to national treatment of investors, that's a pretty important arrow in the quiver of foreign investors. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to solve your problem tomorrow, but at least you can create the conditions where reasonable solutions can be found. And that would be my last comment on this. This isn't a zero-sum exercise, John. It isn't about, someone winning and someone being vanquished. You're going to have to meet people halfway. And that sometimes isn't, if you will, first nature to foreign investors who feel that based on the paperwork that they have, that those entitlements need to be met quite specifically. You got to be flexible. You have to bob and weave. That's just the nature of the way these societies work. And those that do so most successfully, I think, will be the ones who, at the end of the day, will see their fortunes rise.
You bring up so many great points there. So many companies run their government relations through a legal mindset, where either they don't have a government relations and it is the legal department that's running it, or the government relations is very much a US or European or Canadian trained lawyer who brings that mindset to play. And I think that a couple of things that I've learned echoes exactly what you're saying, is that if you take a sort of rigid compliance point of view, and if you're counting on the word of the contract, if you're counting on the word of law as your defense of your position in a market, you're eventually going to run into trouble, because government relations is a contact sport. You've got to form relationships, and all of these things are negotiable. I had a great conversation lunch 2 weeks ago with a lady who runs government relations for one of the biggest brands in the region, and she is constantly putting out fires. And it's, a new law will be proposed, and she will sit down and carve out either an exception for their firm or convince them to change that proposal before it's legislated. And it's the relationships that she has built over the years with these people. Many of these people who actually are the sort of technocrats making things happen will stay in government through successive changes
Absolutely.
of political power. And so they're the people who you need to negotiate with oftentimes. But another great anecdote, I was in Toronto a couple of years ago at PDAC, and I made a comment that said, look, if you're a mining company and you're operating in certain jurisdictions, it's quite possible that it's an organized criminal group that is essentially governing a certain region where your mine happens to be. And whether you like it or not, you're going to have to negotiate with those people. You might use a third-party intermediary, but you're going to have to sit down and strike some sort of operating procedure so that you can get your trucks in and get your minerals out and get your supplies in, keep your people safe and all this sort of stuff. And of course, the lawyers in the room said, we can't advise our companies on, on doing that. But that's what you're talking about. It's it's working in that gray area between the black and white of laws and the very different reality on the ground. So
John, I'm reminded of an old Mexican curse that may your life be filled with lawyers. that someone laid on me shortly after I arrived in Mexico City. You know, look, these when you talk about litigious societies and people who are legalistic, you know, it doesn't run any hotter than in Latin America. These folks learned from the Jesuits. I mean, when it comes to, you know, the letter of the law, they're part of Latin America's challenge is that there is too much law on the books.
Yeah.
And so life becomes, if you will, a sport of getting around it. And that inculcates attitudes that are disconcerting. But if you look to find solace in the law and in legal tribunals, you know, I mean, I was once counseled very early on in my stay in one of the countries I served in that if you were looking at going to court for recourse, you were facing something that could be generational in scope, with all of the legal provisions for stays and, you know, and the greatest invention that Mexico has brought to the legal world, the amparo. You know, I mean, these things are tough to get around, and so you have to do that bobbing and weaving and find creative solutions and work with your network of local partners, because, you know, chances are they've been to that rodeo at least once before, you know, and can help you navigate. And so this is why, you know, I mean, joining local business groups becomes so crucial for Canadian business executives to become part of the local landscape, so you can lean in with those who try to survive in this environment and largely do so successfully, you know, to look for ways out of the particular issues or situations that you might find yourself.
Absolutely. Ambassador, we got some great questions here from our audience. The first one from Javiera Gracia Magallon. She asked, at this moment, and this is a tough question, it's a multi-million-dollar question. At this moment, which countries do you see better positioned to receive foreign investments? It looks like she's most interested in extractive sectors like energy, mining, and infrastructure. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, well, you know, none of them are going to be easy. I mean, you know, they all carry nuance, but I would say that a country that offers some near-term potential after years of kind of being in the lower orders of lists is Colombia. I think the Petro administration so far, knock wood, you know, is governing decently and making some progress in terms of putting forward an economic and social program in the country that's for the good. Now that could change, you know, over the course of the coming months and years of that term, but I would say that that's probably a pretty good place to start. You know, a place that's often ignored in the region, but if you're in the agricultural area, makes an awful lot of sense to be looking at. It has its nuances and particularities. Paraguay, you know, I mean, small country, but a country with, you know, particularly for Canadians, a lot of historical connections to Canada with the Mennonite colonists that went there in the early part of the 20th century. Chile, of course, I mean, I think will continue to be one of the stars of the region. And, you know, as it looks to develop lithium and other things, I think Chile's prospects look exceedingly good. I think, you know, some of the larger countries, the Mexicos, the Brazils. I mean, if you're in you know, consumer-oriented sectors, I mean, it makes a lot of sense to go into those countries because, you know, they have populations whose middle class is larger than the entire population of Canada. You know, with some tenuousness now around inflation and economic growth, but those are huge markets potentially in the consumer area. And then there are, you know, the small jewels, the Costa Ricas of the world. You know, if you're in the oil and gas business, I mean, certainly Guyana is now something that needs to be on your horizon as we watch that country move in an upward kind of direction. But you know, you have to go in all cases eyes wide open and know that whilst a situation today may seem ideal for the kind of investment you want to make, you have to put guardrails up even at the front end to ensure that they're there if things over the course of time begin to get difficult and tenuous. And that means having your own network in place assets that you can call on in the local economy, in the various business communities and legal communities and others, and making those kinds of social investments that, as a foreign investor, that put you in good stead in the society as a good corporate citizen.
Yeah, I think that's what's really changed in the last 7-8 years is the voice, the political voice that now local communities have, and that they found through a combination of communication technology that allows them to get their message out to the world and get it, the help that they've received from NGOs, and as well as the political weaknesses of central governments, and their inability to step in, and their hesitation to apply any kind of muscle to control these local communities. And so I think for a lot of infrastructure and mining projects in particular, that has been probably the greatest source of opposition. So that's not even a telling of what's going on necessarily in the capital and changes of government. It has to do with local communities. So you really got to look deeper,
absolutely,
than the national framework. We've got a question from Juan Gallardo, a good friend and an active participant in these interviews. He was intrigued by your comment about, Latin America finding a greater political voice on the global stage as a bloc. He thinks that Latin America essentially is, and sort of echoing what you said, it's just doesn't have enough political weight to make much of a difference on a global stage, and would be better suited, therefore, to team up with Canada and the United States. Where do you see, I mean, that obviously teaming up with the Americans or following the Americans is probably a more apt way of putting it. But where do you see a hemispheric unity on the global stage, and where it makes sense to act in a hemispheric, political lobbying sort of position?
I think the one area that lends itself to that, and so far hasn't been capitalized on, is the whole global debate around climate. Virtually all of the countries of continental South America have rainforests of some sort. They face the challenges of desertification and issues of that scope, and so I think that would lend itself potentially to the region coming together and putting forward a concerted position of the Latin world, if you will, as this debate accelerates and moves forward into the future. It's interesting that individual countries on individual issues, can have impact that sometimes is quite surprising. I followed recently the introduction of the draft resolution on crimes against humanity, for example, in the Legal Committee of the United Nations, and there it was Mexico that played a very important role in collaboration with Gambia and Bangladesh, not a coalition that one would always associate Latin America becoming involved in, or a Latin country, but that was the coalition that put that forward. I think there are issues where obviously, working in collaboration with the United States makes sense because of the importance that the U.S. has. I'm somewhat disappointed on a personal basis that Canada has not maximized to a much larger extent its good relationship with the region to try to work on a more concerted basis on a range of issues, a limited range of issues with certain countries of the hemisphere. Canada enjoys excellent bilateral relationships with just about everybody, but at the multilateral level, that hasn't really capitalized into joint initiatives that we could do going forward. But I think, and this is also linked back to something I referred to earlier about integration in the region. As the region integrates more, they will ultimately have to work together more. And while we all took a deep breath when Argentina and Brazil started talking about a common currency, if those kinds of initiatives do come to fruition, that by definition is going to bring greater coherence and greater levels of collaboration between countries, and potentially between the region as a whole and its engagement with the world.
I'm curious, you've worked in other developing countries. You also worked at the United Nations. You've had close contact with the diplomatic communities of Africa and of Asia. How do these other developing countries what do they think of Latin America? How do they perceive Latin America? What do they see as Latin America's strengths and weaknesses? So we often hear Latin America's strengths and weaknesses from, North American or European perspective, but I'm curious to see, what do those African countries think of Latin America?
Yeah, Africa's relationship with Latin America is incipient, I think, and a lot of it is linked to commonality of language or even colonial experience. I think Brazil's work in Lusophone Africa, for example, in Angola and in Mozambique, the presence of Petrobras in those economies are examples of good collaboration. I think Africa looks at Latin America as a region that it can both learn from in a positive and negative sense, and also as a region that can source some of the technological inputs that they need for their own development. Asian views of Latin America, I think, and the fact that Latin America has been characterized by so much rapid swings of the pendulum from one extremity to another is something that I think Asians, by definition, have difficulty fathoming. Asia tends to look at things on a much more linear kind of basis, and the volatility, if you will, of certain jurisdictions in Latin America is something that I think gives pause. It's interesting, if you look at Chinese investment in Latin America, by and large, it's about things that China wants for itself, as opposed to investment that is in response to a priority that's been brought forward by a country in what we would construe to be a development kind of initiative. And so I think that gives some relative weight, if you will, to the point of view that the Chinese bring to the region. The region has a lot of what China wants and needs. The Chinese will invest in those things, but it will always be predicated, in my personal judgment, on China's need first, foremost, and last, as opposed to contributing to more altruistic, if you will, developmental considerations going forward, where those coincide with Chinese interests, tant mieux, as they say in French, but it's not something that is first nature to the Chinese as they invest in Latin America and indeed in other parts of the planet. But I think, what's interesting to me is that if you look at the diplomatic representatives of many Asian countries in Latin America speak the local languages better than the locals, and so there's clearly an interest and a desire, to understand, and I think that that can all be good fruit for Latin America to potentially harvest from the point of view of coming together on certain issues where it makes sense to do so. In broader based coalitions of a global nature.
We have a great question. I don't know how much attention you paid to the recent Three Amigos conference in Mexico City. Certainly, there was a great deal of disappointment from the energy sector that the interference by the AMLO administration in the development of just about every part of the energy sector, whether it's power generation with gas, whether it's solar and wind, whether it's distributed energy, in the name of protecting CFE and protecting Pemex's interests, and private companies in the United States have led the charge and threatened litigation. Certainly, Canadian energy interests are at stake as well, and the Biden administration very much did not press forward with this. Some believe that the Biden administration didn't press forward because they asked the Mexicans to slow down the number of non-Mexicans entering Mexico who end up crossing the border illegally in the States, which has become a huge political liability for Biden. And at the end of the day, the states in the United States that are the energy producers and energy sector focused, they don't vote Democrat anyway. So what's your sense there? Is there,
Look, when AMLO was elected, I pretty much took as an article of faith that the progress that Mexico had made in terms of the regulatory environment and the role of the state in the economy was something that was going to be very, very different in this sexennial than what had preceded the previous 3, maybe even 4. And so I think when the history is written, hopefully we will speak of an AMLO interlude in Mexico, where things kind of went in a particular direction that was distinct from what had happened in the previous 20 years. My hope is that whatever follows AMLO, whether it's Morena, whether it's something else, has a much more forward thinking and much more granular view of the role of the state, as an economic driver in the country, and recognizes that it is the private sector and in collaboration with the external foreign private sector that is going to give the kind of dynamic impulse to the Mexican economy that will allow it to move forward positively in the future. But AMLO is an old style pre-politician, notwithstanding his new stripes and suit of clothing. I mean, he very much is a creature of the 70s, and that's the way Mexico was back then. And while he's been nuanced in terms of how far he's pushed, he certainly has pushed enough to make a lot of people nervous who've invested a lot of money in believing that Mexico was moving in a very, very different direction. I would say that the jury is out on the long-term nature of that, and we need to see what follows in the 6 years post-AMLO, if this is something that is going to basically inculcate itself into the very fabric of what Mexico is as an economy, as a country, or whether something different, something nuanced, something that kind of kneels at the altar, of what AMLO says, but moves the country back into a direction that is more in sync, if you will, with the modern requirements of what the Mexican energy and other sectors are going to require. I mean, propping up Pemex and CFE, has been the raison d'etre of a lot of Mexican governments over the course of the last 70, 80 years, and these companies still, aren't working at optimum level. Somewhere along the line, I mean, that penny has to drop. And my sense is that while this is, a step back, it isn't necessarily a step back for always.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Moreno will win the next election, but I think it will be a different kind of leadership. And, at the end of the day, Mexico needs energy. Mexico today is actually when you combine all the different types of energy, Mexico is actually a net energy importer, which is almost impossible to believe. And that's really a result of the fact that they've been unable to add value to their energy deposits. They've been unable to sufficiently harness it, and they need private sector investment to make that happen.
One of the positive things of the Three Amigos Summit was the discussion of the North American idea on a much more fulsome basis than certainly I've heard since the very beginning of the conversation around the trilateral agreements in the 1990s. I think Professor Robert Pastor in heaven had a smile on his face, as he listened to the three leaders wax about the North American idea, if you will, in North America as a platform. And I think at the end of the day, that is what will bring change on the ground in Mexico, and indeed in the other two countries as well, particularly if the nearshoring phenomenon strengthens to the extent that I think it's going to have to in the near to medium term.
Yeah, absolutely. Ambassador, I'm going to try to combine a few questions, including one from your former colleague, Jeremy Pallant, who we both know. And I'm going to ask you to sort of open your crystal ball and look forward and perhaps comment on a couple of things. Number one, some of the challenges that you've brought up, whether it's inequality, corruption, volatility, the thirst for a caudillo solution, and the weakening of at least the recent weakening in a couple of cases of some of these institutions that Latin America investors have relied upon, whether it was fair to rely upon them or not. How do you see those progressing? And what do you see as the challenges and opportunities going forward in Latin America? I know that's a massive question.
Look, I think I give this a lot of thought, John, since our first conversation about this event. I think the two singular things that hold Latin America back are inequality, and inequality not just in the economic sense, but almost in the metaphysical sense. Inequality has been so ingrained over the course of the last 500 years. Some would argue thousands of years in the region, where one group dominates another. And if you're in the dominant group, you want to remain dominant, and you're being dominated. You want a piece of that, even if it means having to tear down those who dominate you. And while economic equality is certainly something that is much greater in the region today than it was even 30 years ago, it is that mindset around everyone, people equal before the law, and people equal in opportunity, equal in their ability to express an opinion. I mean, those are the kinds of things that I think hold back the totality of the region from making advancement. Because if you don't have equality, you can't forge a consensus around what you want your future to be, because the underlying trust just isn't there to allow that to happen. And the other element that I think is a bane on the existence of the region is impunity. There is no consequentiality. It's interesting that in neither Spanish or Portuguese is there a precise translation of the word accountability. And in fact, in many countries of the region, when they talk about accountability, they use the English word, because nothing exists in the local lexicon that approaches what we construe accountability to be. That is, to be held responsible and for there to be consequences. In criminal investigations in Mexico, for example, convictions happen in less than 4% of cases. How is that conceivable in the 21st century? Those are the kinds of things that need to be addressed, because, as long as there is impunity, people believe that they cannot obtain justice. And if they can't obtain justice, then they start looking for extrajudicial means to obtain what they want. So those would be the two key issues. The third issue, for me, is informality. How does Latin America address the reality that in virtually all countries, somewhere between 30 to 50% of the economy is in the informal sector? Those people are not, they're not stakeholders. They're not taxpayers. They may be beneficiaries now through various types of social programs that the government has instituted, but they're not true stakeholders in the future. And that's not to say that they don't have skills that could be brought to the fore and be possible to be contributors to the economy. So I think those three things are the things that the region needs to get a handle on. And I think some countries will do it better than others. And you should watch for how countries are addressing those three things, because that will give a measure, I think, in terms of who is likely to be more successful in the medium term.
Those are great points. It reminds me, I teamed up with a guy named Jerry Hart. I don't know if you know Jerry, and wrote a book called Can Latin America Compete? And we divided competitiveness into 14 chapters, and you touched upon many of the running themes across those. Which country or countries do you think have done a better job than the rest in those three areas?
I think Chile obviously stands first among equals, I think, in terms of how it has addressed those issues. Notwithstanding a pretty rugged 30 years that they had to live through, to come out the other end. I think I have a lot of faith in Colombia, because Colombia, notwithstanding the challenges that it's faced over the course of the last 50 years, has managed to move forward, in spite of itself sometimes, but still moving forward. I think Mexico, notwithstanding the current challenges that we spoke of earlier, is a country that, has been on a path moving forward, but still has huge problems along the floor of inequality, impunity, and informality. Costa Rica, while small, works. Panama, historically has worked fairly well. I watch Guyana quite closely now, because here you have a country that is about to take off. I mean, I think they had GDP growth of triple digits at one point, in the last couple of years. I mean, can they harness that tiger and make it work to the benefit of that society, or will they succumb to arguing over the benefits and fritter it away? I think Brazil has made enormous strides as a country and as a society. I was posted there in the 1980s when the military was still in power, and went back 20 years later, and the country was it was unrecognizable in terms of the changes. But change brings other challenges that you didn't anticipate. I still want to believe that Argentina, will get its collective act together at some juncture down the road. I mean, it is where I think the culture of risk is deepest in the region, in my judgment. It's certainly where you see people willing to place a bet on something, sometimes not with the results that they're looking for. I'm very disconcerted by what I see in Peru, because I think what it's done is that it's unleashed the demons that have been lying beneath the surface for a very, very long time. And a country that was doing fairly well, now runs real risk in terms of a protracted period of a lot of churn that isn't necessarily good. Ecuador, same kind of thing, and I mean, the countries with large indigenous majorities, I think, are countries that need to deal with that reality first and foremost in a very forthright manner. I mean, if they're going to come out somewhere where they can begin to dream, of a collective future as nations, as opposed to groups that are at loggerheads with each other. So I think you have to pick and choose your spots. You can't be everywhere. And I think contingent on the industry that you're in, the nature of the investments, if you're betting on continued middle class growth over the medium term, then there's a handful of countries that stand out where the middle class should move forward. And but I think that for me, the greatest change that I've seen in the region from the time I first started going there in the 1970s until now that I left it when I retired back here in Canada, is that people now believe in Latin America that they can have a future where they live as opposed to having to go somewhere. And that is a huge sea change in terms of public attitudes. Now, that's not to say that they don't have, a little nest egg somewhere just in case, because that's the way these societies have organized themselves. But when you start believing that you can have a future in your own country, that means that you're prepared to stand and fight to make your society and country better. And that, at the end of the day, is an energy input that, if harnessed appropriately, can lead to very positive changes as people begin to forge the kind of consensus necessary to move societies forward.
That's a great point. I really like that last point you made. Look, I really appreciate all your insights and wisdom. I think for many of us in the call who are looking at our particular businesses, worried about what's happening this year, I think that this is very telling. It really does help people understand that there's light at the end of this tunnel, that we're just part of another cycle. Not to say that you can be complacent, but I think that hearing your telling of the arc of a 40-year view on things, of you being on the ground, seeing the real inner workings of three of the biggest markets in the region, really helps people understand where they are today, and particularly companies who've made long-term investments in the region. That is especially valuable. So I thank you for your insights, your time, and always a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you so much, Ambassador.
Great, John. Enjoyed it immensely, and greetings to everybody.
All right. All the best.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.